Videos are going to go over a concept called factoring, and specifically solving quadratic equations by factoring. And so we've been solving quadratic equations by graphing, which I know is everybody's favorite topic, and now we're going to be doing it by factoring. If you remember from earlier, this is an example of a quadratic equation because it has four parts, the word quad meaning four, but we learned the double distributive property to write it out as this polynomial instead, but most of the time we just refer to this as a quadratic function. But the last video that I required to show you reminds you that either A or B have to be equal to 0, remembering that if A times B equals 0, that either one of these things has to be equal to 0 in order to equal 0 overall. So we would solve this equation by doing 1x plus 5 equals 0, and 1x minus 3 equals 0, giving us our two zeros from our equation. If you do not recognize any of this, make sure you go back and rewatch the video on the zero product property. Now, this is solving quadratic equations where the a value is 1. And remember that the a value is what's with the x squared. So if the number in front of x squared is not 1, you are not in the right video. So let's review solving quadratic equations. And we were always graphing and trying to find the zeros of the graph. And the zeros meant where y equals 0 on the graph. So where are the locations where y equals 0? So for example, if we had the crossing the y-axis twice, we had two zeros and therefore two solutions. If it just touched the y-axis, that means it had one solution or one intercept. And then sometimes you couldn't solve the problem because it never hit the y-axis and therefore would have no zeros or no solutions. So let's use that to start solving a problem by factoring, because when we solved equations by graphing, it took a really long time. So this method is going to be much quicker, but it's a little bit harder to learn at face value. So on that very first equation that we started with on the first page, we have x squared plus 2x minus 15 is equal to 0. And now we know that it was actually written like this. And what factoring is instead of doing the distributive property from here to here, factoring is going back in the opposite direction and solving it from the right to the left. So we are trying to write it in the parentheses backwards. Now, because this is a quadratic equation, there are four terms inside our parentheses, okay? So we're trying to make this go backwards into that. Now, if we actually multiplied it out, what we really have is we have four terms written out like this, which equals 2x here in the middle. But stick with me for just a second, because if I'm doing the double distributive property, 1 times 3 gives us this first term right here. 1 times 4, gives us this term right here. 2 times 3 gives us this term in the middle. And then finally, 2 times 4 gives us this final term here on the outside. And what that means basically is that when we are solving by factoring, the first two values in each parenthesis are the easiest to identify, because this first term must be 1x squared, which means this term has to be 1x, and this term has to be 1x as well. So we have already done half of our factoring automatically, because the first term of each, 1 to 3, has to multiply to be x squared. Now the last term, 2 to 4, creates this final term here on the outside. That final term on the outside is negative 15, which means that 2 times 4, or object 2 times object 4, has to be equal to negative 15. So because we are multiplying to negative 15, we need to find factors of negative 15. Now, when we're thinking of factors, it is better to just think of them as positive numbers for now because either one of these terms could be negative. Now, so once we have the first two terms and the final two terms created, now we have to figure out how we make this middle term. And you notice here, the middle terms are always being added or subtracted to each other. So on this problem right here, we are looking at negative 15, which means one of our items must be positive and one of our items must be negative right away. But when we add them together in the middle, we have to create a positive 2. So I'm going to look at my factors and I'm going to create a positive 2. So if I did 1 minus 15, that would create negative 14. Not what we want. If I did, for example, 15 minus 1 creates positive 14, does not work. 3 minus 5 creates negative 2, which does not work, but it's really close. And I get 5 minus 3 is equal to a positive 2. So I have found my factors that I'm looking for. So that means in the second and the fourth place, I need to put a positive 5 and a negative 3. And I did that once again by looking at the factors of the final term and using them to add or subtract to create the middle term, which in this case is 2. Now, you always want to check to see if your factoring was correct. So I do 1x times 1x gives me x squared. 1x times negative 3 is negative 3x. 5 times 1x is positive 5x. And then finally, positive 5 times negative 3 gives us negative 15, which is correct because this term in the middle gives us positive 2x. So we now have finished our factoring correctly, and now we have to solve using the zero product property. Zero product property says I set each of these equal to 0. Whoops. Equal to 0. Equal to 0. So in this case, x equals negative 5 and x equals positive 3. So here are my two answers to this problem. So that is factoring in a nutshell. Now I'm going to show you basically why did we want to learn factoring and why does it really help us. So we know that from our last problem, our answers to our equation are this, which means we intersect the y-axis here and here. And then how does this help us graph faster? Well, we know that the vertex must be opposite b over 2a. b is 2, so the opposite of 2 is negative 2. 2 times a would be 2, so our b value is negative 1, which makes sense because our axis of symmetry has to be halfway between these 2 points. So our axis of symmetry is right through here, okay? Then we plug in negative 1 into our equation, which helps us find our vertex, which we know must be way down here at the bottom. So if I do negative 1 squared is positive 1, minus 2 minus 15 is equal to 0 means our vertex must be negative 16. So way down here. So our graph will look something like this. And now we've created the graph and we've solved the graph simply by using factoring. Now, this is a video that I strongly recommend watching the retake regardless for, because I'm going to do 2 more examples. So if you watch the retake video, even if you pass this video, you automatically get 5 SPs by showing me your notes at the end of the process. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.